Hello everybody, welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Pramod Nair of the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad. In this module, we are going to be looking at public and private spaces. The objectives of this module are to look at how space is constructed, how we experience it, how it is monitored, and how we consume it. We are going to be making a distinction between the way public space is constructed and used from the way we believe private space should be utilized, and finally the merging of public and private space. In other words, the objective or set of objectives of this particular module is to look at our experience of the physical spaces around us. Before we move on to understanding the finer aspects of space, it is essential to note the difference between space and place. Space and place are not the same. Space is not the physical territorial landscape around us. Space is socially constructed. For example, the large area in your classrooms is a classroom only because a certain kind of activity takes place there. The actual physical structure is a place. When there are teachers and students, it becomes space. In other words, what we are looking at is the social construction of space out of the physical qualities, the physical structure, the physical features of something we know as place. Space is therefore contextual. It is about meaning. It is about what we do there. Let me give you a simple example. If we take the classroom and instead of teaching, we start playing sports inside, does it remain a classroom? See, physically speaking, it remains a place with benches, chairs, the teacher's speaking platform, and the blackboard or whiteboard. However, the activities that occur there are not what it was designed for. In other words, the classroom does not remain a classroom if the teacher and student are not participating in a particular kind of activity. Space is therefore socially constructed based on what is actually done by human beings in there. In other words, what we are looking at is space is the effect of a set of meanings we give to that particular territorial and physical experience. We do not all experience space the same way. Women and older people find it difficult to get into, say, a public transport bus or the railway carriage or negotiate stairs. Do we think stairs are therefore neutral spaces? They are not. Spaces are experienced differently by people with joint problems, people who are physically challenged, and the blind. They do not have the same sense of space. And I'm using the word sense of space for you to understand that we experience space differently based on who we are, what our bodies are like. If you pay attention to the Government of India's initiatives in public places, there has been a concerted attempt to make sure that physical places of stairs, elevators, first floor buildings are made more accessible to people of various physical attributes. It has been part of the principle in the West for a very long time that physically challenged people should have special pathways that enable them to go to higher floors of a building. What we are therefore looking at is that we invest that space with a set of meanings, that space must be available and accessible to people no matter what their physical bodies are like. The space being organized as private and public has to do not only with their being inside the house or outside the house, but with the kind of meanings we attribute to these regions. It is of course not very clear nowadays where the public ends and the private begins, and I shall come to that in a while. Take the example of a hotel. A hotel by definition is a public space. However, for the person who is staying in a room within the hotel, having paid for it, the room is a private space within a public space. So the hotel by definition being a public space does not make the resident's room also public. His room or her room, having paid for it, is his or her private space. So the hotel then might be characterized as being both public and private. By definition, a public place is one which is open to all. Cinemas, malls, parks, museums, playgrounds are by definition public spaces. This kind of definition, however, immediately poses certain kinds of problems. By definition, is it possible for anyone to access these places? Are we all given equal rights of entry and exit into, say, a museum? We will be looking at the museum in some detail later on, but I would like you to keep this in mind. Let us ask another kind of question. Let us take the public street. By definition, it's open to all. However, the question you have to ask is, would women feel safe walking on public streets after 6 in the evening? Do older people find it easier to cross the road, which is a public space, at any given time of the day? Now you see, we have immediately run into problems. By definition, it's public. Therefore, any member of the public should by definition be allowed to be there, feel comfortable there, and do whatever they wish to do there. But the actual reality is something totally different. The meaning of any particular space is constructed for us through various discourses. It could be government functions, it could be signage, as in notices, do not spit here, no smoking. These are also ways of experiencing space. If you look at your own school and college buildings, there will be notices here. For example, the best case you can think of is your library. The library is public space which has signs posted all over: do not talk, maintain silence. Our experience of that space is already conditioned when we look at that sign and say, oh, here I must not speak, here I should keep my cell phone on the silent mode. Think, on the other hand, of public events like a cricket match, also a public event where it's more than a few thousand people who come to the stadium at one point of time. These are public spaces experienced in a certain way. The point you also need to understand is, people who are in certain spaces become certain kinds of subjects. The person who is in a stadium is a subject of the sporting event. The children who are in a classroom are subjects who are called students. The people who work in a government office are called public servants, because they are servants of the general public of that particular nation or culture or state. The space of the mall is a particularly interesting case of what we now understand as public space. The mall is a space of consumption. It's a place where you go to shop, to relax, or to meet people. In the late 20th century, the mall is a particularly interesting space. While on the one hand it does appear to be public space, it is not really public. Why it is not really public, I will come to in a minute. But before we go on to that, let us look at a very specific kind of space like the museum. What does the museum do? The museum is a public space in which artifacts from our past have been preserved. You will remember school excursions where children are taken to look at the artifacts in a museum. The museum is a public space where the history of a nation or the history of a culture are documented and consumed by its passive spectators. The museum does not just give you objects. The museum tells you a story or set of stories. Those stories that we experience when we view objects, watch paintings, watch a performance, whatever it might be, tells us the history of a particular nation. Now, to return to the question of the mall. The mall is the street taken inside. It has the same function as maybe the bazaar area about 20 years ago. However, the difference is the mall is a highly regulated space. The people who go in there are designated as consumers. The people who go in there have to function in certain ways. Take an instance. In a mall, do you see the pani puri seller or the peanut vendor? You don't. The mall, by definition a public space, automatically regulates who can authorized, legitimized to experience that particular space. The public opinion as to, oh, how should we behave here, or how should we behave in a museum, are determined by the discourse of space. To give you the two examples in another format, The museum regulates your experience of space by telling you this is a serious place. You have to experience it in a serious way. The mall, on the other hand, is a space of leisure. You don't go to the museum to relax. You go to the museum to learn. You go to the mall to relax. You don't go to the mall to learn. Okay, you do learn, but that's not the purpose of the mall. The mall is a space of consumption. What this means is the space of the mall or the space of the museum is determined in a particular way so that you experience it in a particular way. The meanings of the mall are already made available to us through various methods. The newspaper that advertises what products are sold, the shop windows, the signage that tell you, oh, this is a place where I should learn to relax. It's highly unlikely that you go to the mall to do your homework. That's not what you do in a mall. This brings us to an important aspect of public spaces. All spaces are not really open social spaces in the very strict definition of the term. The people who visit, say, the shopping mall or the public park have to gain access to that particular space. If you are, for instance, not appropriately dressed, do not look as though you are a serious consumer, the shopping mall is a place that discourages you. For a very long time now, if you have been reading the newspapers, you will discover people complaining that the parks in the cities in India are disappearing, and the old people rarely have a place to walk in because the street is not a very safe place to walk. What are we talking about when we say that? What we are saying is there is no public space which is also guaranteed to offer safety to the older citizens of our country. You can very well say, but what prevents them from walking on the road? What prevents them from walking on any street? The answer is, at their age, the street is not the safest zone to walk in. While they definitely do, in theory, have access to that public space, in practice, it is not the best place for them to be in, which is why parks have designated walking areas for the older generation. The same applies to children and the game or play areas. Think of another space like religious spaces. The religious space, whether it's of a temple or a mosque, is also by definition, in theory, a public space. However, we all know that in all practically religions that we know around us, it is restricted to, say, women, to the kinds of clothes you can actually wear to church or temples or mosques. What are we looking at here? We are looking at the question of legitimate access. Who is authorized to be here? Who is allowed to be here? The question of regulating entry is one part of it. The second question is of regulating behavior once you are inside. You will remember that I already mentioned the question of signage, of signs within a mall, for example, or in a museum. Do not spit. What does it mean? This building is under surveillance. What does that mean? In a museum, it will be written in large letters, please do not touch the objects. Walk along here. In the zoo, you have a notice which saying, please do not feed the animals, which means you do not feed food or you do not feed yourself to the animals either. But what is that supposed to mean? It means once you have been given access, you continue to follow a system of behavior within that particular space. So when we say, oh, it's a public space, it is not public in the sense you can do whatever you want. No, public space, if you do not behave properly, is also the space of your punishment. Take a look at surveillance, which is now the single most signifying feature of any public space. Ever since 9/11 in particular and terrorist attacks all over the world, public spaces are the most monitored spaces in the world. There is practically no public space which doesn't have at least one CCTV, closed circuit television, that observes its people. What does a CCTV do? CCTV determines who is allowed in, who should be kept out. It also monitors the behavior of those who are already in. It makes sure there's a documentary evidence of people who have been inside that particular mall during or public space during that particular period of time. In one way, therefore, public space is regulated, and that's the point I want to really emphasize. When we say public space is what all of us are equally entitled in theory to experience, which also means that I have a responsibility to behave in a particular way in that particular space and not infringe, not violate some other person's use of that space. The role of surveillance is precisely to make sure that all of us have equal rights to that space. I now move on to a discussion of private space. Having looked at spaces that are open to all, I am now going to look at private space which are not by definition open to all. Private spaces are individualized spaces or individual spaces. It has a set of meanings for an individual person, a set of meanings that have been determined by the community, such as a family that lives in that particular space. The most important part of our experience of private space is the psychological comfort or security we experience there. This means anybody who enters my personal or private space is seen as a threat to that private or personal space. In other words, what we are looking at is our notion that a personal space must not be violated without my explicitly welcoming someone to do so. There are norms of behavior in private space as well. However, I now want to turn to a very peculiar feature of the late 20th century, a feature made possible or which has come into being due to the arrival of electronic gadgets and telecommunication devices. The distinctions between private and public is now very hard to sustain. People who shoot selfies in public spaces would be a good example of how the space of the public meant for collective enjoyment has been transformed into the place where a private activity takes place and is then broadcast. The other example that several of you might be more or less familiar with and annoyed by is the change that the cell phone has made to the notion and experience of public space. Why is it that when we travel in a public space, when we walk or experience public space, you overhear somebody else's private conversations? Our experience of public space has been changed because we somehow, despite our best manners and despite our unwillingness, participating in somebody else's private space, because the personal communications technologies, the PCTs, which includes the cell phone, change the world around the person wearing those devices. To them, they are on the phone, but to you, they are an annoyance. An example would be our use of any public transport system now, where people play music and talk on phones endlessly. Our experience of public space, therefore, has been altered because somebody has converted the public space into private experience. That unwilling to acknowledge that your private conversation can be a nuisance to somebody else. In the West, therefore, they have introduced bus and train carriages that are mandatorily cell phone free, in the sense you are not allowed to use a cell phone there. We can therefore see how public spaces have been transformed into partly private spaces. I would not say that they are entirely private. They are increasingly blurred margins between the private and the public. You can also see how public spaces become transformed into privatized domains. One instance of how the public and private distinction becomes rather nebulous is through scandals, where the activities of public figures in private become the subject of public debate. Somebody has been immoral or corrupt, the discussion of the person's private life occurs in the public domain. The distinction between public and private is broken down. We can readily ask, why are we interested in a person's personal life? The answer is, if that person is a public figure, if that person is a figure in public authority, if that person holds power, then their private lives must be subject to the scrutiny of the people they are authorities over. In other words, what I am looking at here and what I am trying to get you to see is that the activities in private of a public figure are subject to public scrutiny as well. This again breaks down the distinction between public and private. A good example would be the writings and documents about personal lives that have been, say, in gossip columns that begin to make waves and become scandal sheets. And the immediate response is, ministers shouldn't behave like that, priests shouldn't behave like that, public figures shouldn't behave like that. As you can see, it's increasingly hard to sustain the public-private distinction with any clarity. The use of technology transforms public space into private spaces. It takes private moments, private contexts, private events and makes them public. Notice that practically 80% of the material available on social networking devices are actually personal moments. Why do they become public? What we are looking at is that the public is increasingly made up of small private units. I would now like to summarize what we have looked at so far. Our account of space began by looking at space as socially constructed, that our experience of space is the experience of a set of meanings that we bestow upon it, meanings that happen, are registered because of the events and actions that unfold them. Place is physical territory, space is lived, experienced, socially constructed place. We then moved on to a discussion of public space, which is defined as space to which all by definition have access. We also recognize the fact that the question of access is not automatic, that space can be accessed by only certain people, with certain bodies, with certain abilities. When we say public space, we are also looking at the right to that space. But we also need to understand that public spaces are heavily regulated. The museum, the mall, the religious space, the playgrounds might give you access, but what you do after you enter that space is increasingly regulated. The question of surveillance practically defines public space now. How we experience the space of the market, the theater, the shopping mall is determined by the presence of closed circuit television that observes and documents what we do. Therefore, surveillance is one integral feature of how we experience that particular public space. We also then turned to the question of private spaces, the space which help us psychologically feel secure and at home. We concluded by noting that the lines between public and private are increasingly blurred. This is due to the arrival of personal communications technologies that make, for instance, a private conversation between a person and somebody else the subject of public debate and public discussion, because you can overhear what's going on. The listening to music in public, the watching of films in public, all change the public experience of the other people around them. We concluded by looking also at the scandals that take the private moments of individuals into the public domain. For instance, the question of figures in public authority, whether they have a right to privacy, it's a frequently debated issue in newspapers now, has most definitely swung away from the figures in authority. The argument being that figures in public authority do not really have the same kind of right to privacy, and most of the time, because they are in authority, their private moments need to be as publicly scrutinized as anybody else. Thank you.